Good evening. Welcome. It's so moving to be in this particular home, in this particular room with Ilija and with you. It means so much to the meaning of exile and what it means to welcome the stranger. So I can't think of a better place to have this conversation. So Ilija, this is a remarkable text which we're going to talk about tonight. I have been able to read an excerpt of it and most of it in English. And I think tonight we're going to give you a taste of it. It's a text that really, Ilija is really inventing a language to talk about the experience of exile. And I think you'll hear it in the two different languages that he'll read from tonight. But why don't you tell us a little bit how it's set up, and then we'll talk about its inspiration after you read some of it, the numbering system, and just give us a little taste of how you've put it on the page.
Well, good evening, everyone. Great to be back. So, I grew up, I love cooking, and I grew up with my grandmother in Bulgaria. And there's a very specific dish which, if you wanted to translate it, you would probably say it's an Irish stew. It has a Turkish name, türlü. And the idea is that if you cannot decide what you're going to eat, just put everything into the stew. And I think the book is a little bit like that, because as someone who experienced fleeing and who's been preoccupied with that subject all my life, through my parents, my personal experience, but also many of the people that I've encountered, I was searching for the necessary complexity. I thought that the normal narratives are just too much caught up in pre-consisting notions of what it is to flee, but especially what it means for the rest of your life. There's a certain understanding of, or expectation of, arrival. People assume that once you've overcome the political, economic difficulties that initially encumber everyone, that at some point you would arrive, and then story over. But that is not the case. I think arrival is a fata morgana. It's something that never happens the way local people expect it to happen. There's always a part of you that's somewhere else. There's always a shadow of other biographies that you might have had. There are always ruptures that cannot heal completely. So all of this, I thought, would have to find a form that is as full of ambivalence, ambiguity, as the experience itself. Which is why I thought to myself, it would have to be a very experimental text, in that you would have many different forms of text that are not linked together in a kind of causal, logical sense, but there's more kind of a very organic, associative link between them all.
Yes, and I like that, even though, as you'll hear, it's not logical, but you've used the form of mathematics, in a sense, to kind of hold it, to give it a spine. And so we're numbering. We start with one, with the Arabic numbers, right? Or do you start?
No, we start with the Latin numbers.
Start with the Latin numbers, right? So you'll see it's going counting down and counting up. So you're holding it together, and those are also a cultural construct too. I mean, the numbers themselves that you're using.
Well, of course, two different editions.
Two different editions.
I mean, we say Arabic and Latin. But not only that, it's in a way there's a kind of circularity, because I think the very last sentence in the book could very well be the first sentence as well. And I think because the first half, the Latin numbers, is called von den Verstörungen in German, on the disturbances maybe. And the second part is von den Verheißungen, which is promises or salvation or whatever it might be. So in a way it's going up and down, but it's also going through two different motions of being thrown out of paradise and of searching a new paradise, or searching kind of the golden land of arrival, which is a yearning, but not something that you would ever find.
I don't think you could ever hear a piece of literature described as much as a work of music as you just did. I mean, it really sounds like it's a composition. Let's hear some.
So I'm going to read the German first, and then the English. So if you have a smattering of German, you might want to test it. Erster Teil. 1. Die Flucht rechtfertigt sich selbst. Das Leben danach stellt immer wieder neue Fragen. Part 1, number 1. Flight justifies itself. Life thereafter continues to raise new questions. 2. Nichts an der Flucht ist flüchtig. Sie stülpt sich über das Leben und gibt es nie wieder frei. 2. There's nothing fleeting about flight. It engulfs life and never again sets it free. 3. Stets wird der Geflüchtete vorgestellt als einer, der einst von woanders kam, der spät in einer Winternacht in den Gasthof trat, der nicht eingeladen war. Ein Mündel, dem ein Teller Suppe vorgesetzt wurde, weil es sich so ziemt. Egal wie viele Jahre seit seiner Flucht vergangen sind, die Einheimischen kennzeichnen ihn als jemanden, der etwas Essentielles nicht mit ihnen teilt. Selbst die kürzeste Biografie hat Platz für seine Bindestrich-Identität. Ob es daran liegt, fragt er sich, dass er immer noch in seiner Muttersprache zählt? 3. Having fled, he is always introduced as someone who once came from elsewhere, who entered the inn on a winter's night, uninvited. A ward served a plate of soup, as would befit him. No matter how many years have passed since his flight, locals mark him as one with whom they lack some essential commonality. Even the shortest biography makes space for his hyphenated identity. Could it be because he still counts in his mother tongue? He wonders. 5. Einschulung. Er kann einige Wortbrocken, seine Mutter kann einige Wortbrocken. Gemeinsam stehen sie am ersten Schultag vor der Tür der Rektorin. Sie haben sich verspätet. Klasse 1b, sagt die Rektorin, im 2. Stock. Sie deutet nach oben. Eine breite Treppe. Als sie in den Gang biegen, wird eine Tür zugeschlagen. Die Mutter klopft an die Tür. Herein, ein Raum voller Kinder in seinem Alter. Er beginnt sich zu schämen. Die Rede seiner Mutter, ein Radebrech. Er kann es nicht besser. Nein, 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 wehrt die Lehrerin mit beiden Händen ab. Ich habe schon 4 Türken in meiner Klasse. Und scheucht Mutter und Sohn davon. Die Treppe hat beim Hinabsteigen mehr Stufen. Er weiß, was passieren wird. Sie werden wieder zur Rektorin gehen müssen. Er schämt sich noch mehr. Die Rektorin erhebt sich, sie marschiert durch den Gang, die Treppe hinauf, den oberen Gang entlang, zur Klassenzimmertür. Sie reißt die Tür auf und spricht ein kurzes Wort. Er setzt sich in die letzte Reihe. Weil er wenig versteht, schaut er sich verstohlen um. Wer wohl die 4 türkischen Kinder sind? 5. First day of school. He can manage a few scraps of words. His mother can manage a few scraps of words. Together they stand in front of the principal's door. They are late. Class 1B, says the principal. 2nd floor, she points upwards, a wide staircase. As they turn into the hallway, a door is slammed shut. The mother knocks on the door. Come in. A room full of children his age. He starts to feel shame. His mother's speech is broken. He himself can do no better. No, no, no. The teacher fends them off with both hands. I already have 4 Turks in my class. And she shoos away mother and son. The staircase has more steps on the way down. He knows what will happen. They will have to go to the principal again. He feels even more shame. The principal rises, marches through the hallway, up the steps, down the length of the hallway upstairs to the classroom door. She pulls the door open and says something brief. He sits down in the last row. Because he understands very little, he looks around furtively. Who then are the 4 Turkish kids? »14. Jeder Geflüchtete kommt auf seine Weise an, manche am Morgen nach der Flucht, andere in jenem Augenblick, da ihnen die Einbürgerungsurkunde überreicht wird, manche immer wieder, andere nie. Bei seiner Mutter geschieht es an jenem Tag, an dem sie wieder Gastgeberin sein darf, an dem Abend, an dem sie zum ersten Mal im Neuland jemanden empfangen und bewirten kann. Nicht andere Geflüchtete, die Geschichten tauschen wie Zigaretten, sondern Einheimische, die sie ohne Absicht und frei von Zweck kennengelernt hat. Sie hat sich überwinden müssen, sie einzuladen. Sie kratzt das Geld zusammen für ein Mahl, das den bescheidensten eigenen Ansprüchen genügt. Sie stürzt sich in die Gelegenheit. Sie ist gänzlich anwesend. Sie vergisst für einige glückliche Momente die grammatikalischen Fehler, die ihr beim mühsamen Scherzen unterlaufen. Strahlend tischt sie ihre Ankunft auf. »14. Those who have fled arrive in their own way, some on the morning after the flight, others in that very moment when their naturalization papers are handed over to them. Some arrive time and again, others never. For his mother, arrival comes on the day she is able to play hostess again, the evening she can entertain for the first time in the new country. Not others who have fled, those who exchange stories like cigarettes, but locals whom she has come to know without intention and free of motive. She can hardly bring herself to invite them. She scrapes together the money for a meal that meets the most modest of her expectations. She gives herself over to the occasion. She is fully present. For a few happy moments, she forgets the grammatical errors that slip through her painstaking banter. She serves up her arrival with a dazzling smile. Now something about language. 28. Irgendwann, wenn er sich hineingehört hat, wenn sich seine Zunge gedehnt und sein Geist gekrümmt hat, wenn er nicht mehr aus seiner eingefleischten Sprache in die Phantomsprache übersetzt, sondern den Kaffee bestellt, ohne nachzudenken, wie eine Tasse Kaffee bestellt wird. Irgendwann, wenn er den Unterschied zwischen heiß, heißen und Verheißung verstanden hat, gilt der Geflüchtete als Sprachwechsler. Das gemahnt an Geldwechsler. Unausgesprochen der Argwohn, dieser Mensch habe einen schlechten Kurs erwischt, den Reichtum seiner mütterlichen Sprachwährung eingetauscht gegen eine schwächer notierte Fremdwährung oder umgekehrt und zudem teuer Kommission bezahlt. Aber was hat er gewechselt? Die Schuhe, die Kleidung, die Adresse, die Haarfarbe, vielleicht sogar den Musikgeschmack, nicht aber die Sprache. Man kann die Sprache nicht wechseln. Man kann bestenfalls eine neue adoptieren. 28. At some point, once he has listened his way in, stretched his tongue, bent his spirit, when he no longer has to translate from the entrenched language into the phantom language, when he orders a cup of coffee without having to think about how to order a cup of coffee, and at some point when he understands the difference between bear to bear and bearing, he who has fled can be regarded as a tongue changer. This brings to mind the money changer, the tacit suspicion of being stuck with a bad exchange rate, swapping out the strong currency of his mother tongue for the weaker currency of a foreign one, or vice versa, and paying a hefty commission. But what did he exchange? Shoes, clothing, hair color, maybe even his taste in music, but not language. Languages cannot be exchanged. At best, one can adopt a language. We didn't decide for how long I should do it.
What is the part
But
about...
let me finish with a joke. Is that it?
You may.
Is that a good idea?
Yeah. And then I'll have you read the Amazon at the end.
Okay. So this is the second part. Arabische Buchstaben, 54. Sein Schneider heißt Elias und stammt aus Alexandria. Jedes Mal, wenn er ihn aufsucht, um den Bund zu weiten, erzählt Elias ihm ein und dieselbe Geschichte. Ein feiner Herr auf Besuch in dieser Metropole habe einen Maßanzug bestellt, doch da der Lehrling die Angaben falsch abgeschrieben habe, sitze der Anzug bei der Anprobe nicht richtig. Eigentlich ein Problem, das sich leicht korrigieren ließe. Müsste der Herr nicht am selben Abend noch in die Oper und sein anderer Anzug sei in der Reinigung. Ja, das kriegen wir hin, habe der Schneider zuversichtlich erklärt und dem Kunden gezeigt, wie er den einen Arm leicht zu strecken und das eine Bein leicht einzuziehen habe, damit der Anzug halbwegs anständig passe. Vorgeführt, nachgemacht. In der Pause nach dem zweiten Akt im Foyer des Opernhauses schleppt sich der Herr an zwei vornehm gekleideten Gleichaltrigen vorbei. Ach, was ist dieser Mensch gestraft mit einem so schrecklichen Gebrechen, sagt der eine. Aber schau mal, erwidert der andere, was für einen famosen Schneider er hat. '54. His tailor is named Elias and comes from Alexandria. Every time he goes to him, Elias tells him the same story. An elegant gentleman visiting the metropolis had ordered a bespoke suit, but because the apprentice wrote down the wrong measurements, it didn't sit correctly when he tried it on. This problem could in fact have been easily resolved had the gentleman not planned to go to the opera that very night, and his other suit was at the cleaner's. "I will figure this out," the tailor declared, showing his client that with a slight stretch of one arm and a bend in one leg, the suit fit halfway decently. The tailor demonstrated, the client imitated. In the intermission after the second act, the gentleman hobbled past two finely dressed contemporaries. "Oh, the poor man! What a fate to be so deformed," said one. "But take a look, what a splendid tailor he must have," replied the other one. I always thought that this joke is actually enough commentary on all discussions about integration.
Yeah, I think you did.
I thought that's the joke to end all integration debate.
What is the line? I don't know if that you read it. You said when someone doesn't ask where someone is from, but asks, "What does your name mean? Who are you named for?" Is that the line?
Yeah, something like that. This is actually based on a very moving experience that a friend of mine had, who was teaching in a school with many kids from other countries. And he asked them, he's a poet, and the idea was that he would try and teach them a little bit about writing. And the very first lesson he asked them, "What does your name mean, and why were you given this name?" Now, several really interesting things happened. The first one was that many of the young kids didn't know the answer to that, neither to the first nor to the second question. The second was that they went back home and they asked their parents, and the very next day they came back with a story to tell. And some of the stories were actually humorous, some were sad, some were tragic. And quite a number of them held within themselves certain aspects of the story of that family, of flight, of previous life. So by telling the story of why they were named the way they were named and what the name means, they constructed initial kind of narrative bridges between one another. And that went on and on and on, and it kind of broke the ice. And at the end of the year, 2/3 of them were actually writing texts. It was,
fantastic.
It was quite amazing. So that really touched me, because I thought it's so easy to start looking at one another by asking certain questions that are meaningful.
Right.
As opposed to asking where you're from, which doesn't really tell you much. Asking, for example, why, what does your name mean? Why were you given?
So who were you named for?
Well, Elias, in kind of, that's the big picture. You know him from the Old Testament. He has anger management issues. But otherwise, my grandfather. And it's always fascinated me that in a number of cultures, there's this understanding that grandparents and grandchildren share kind of a common. And this seems to be the case, because we're the only two artists in the family. He was a musician, and then he became the director of the opera in Sofia. So I grew up with opera. Instead of listening to fairy tales, I had to listen to librettos.
Nice. Yeah, I wanted to have that be one of the first questions. I want to give you an idea of how you conceived this piece, and it's very moving. You were in the Museum of Modern Art in New York, and you saw a series that's a very paradigmatic series of paintings from American art history. You saw Jacob Lawrence's The Migration series. It's not at all, I guess if we had the book to hold up, you would see that the cover is one picture from Jacob Lawrence, and he did it in 40, what year is it, 40?
Was it 40 or 41?
41, yeah. Yeah, he was invited to do it, and he was very, very young when he did it.
Yeah.
And his family had come up from the Great Migration from the South.
Exactly.
So tell us a little bit how it hit you and how it sparked these ideas.
Well, I think these are, if you haven't seen them, these are, I think, iconic paintings, because they're not very big, and I think there are 50 of them. And basically they tell the story of one of the most important kind of inner American migration cycles. People coming from the South looking for work in the north of the USA. What struck me immediately is that I had a sense that this was very much art within a specific historical context, but at the same time of universal appeal. So I had a sense that some of them illustrated my story, some of them illustrated stories of other people, refugees that I know very well. That was the first thing. The other thing was that they are an exercise in the beauty of simplicity. He doesn't use a lot of technique, but the effect is...
It's a restricted palette of colors, right?
Colors are very restricted, forms are restricted. But at the same time, there's something immensely powerful about the effect it had on me. And I thought to myself, this is what we need. We need to look at migration, exile, fleeing in a way that makes the common denominator of human experience visible, as opposed to very particular, which is part of the political discourse all the time. I mean, who is fleeing? Why are you fleeing? What are the reasons? And so on and so forth. All this discussion in Germany about, do you have a good cause to flee? Basically, there's a kind of very judgmental analysis of the reasons you fled, and there are good reasons and bad reasons, which of course is demeaning. No one flees for the fun of it. So I thought this is what we need. And at the same time, I realized that since my own experience was at that point 40 years ago, 45 years ago, I thought that I had enough distance to kind of enter now or engage with experiences from with a certain aloofness, with a certain, let's say, ambition of wisdom as opposed to kind of ambition of personal emotion.
And it's a series, so it's 60
I can't remember whether it was 50
half
or 60.
Half of them went to MoMA and half of them went to another collection.
I think in Philadelphia.
Yeah, I think in the Philadelphia collection.
Yeah.
So the image that's in the middle of the book is of people moving briskly, carrying suitcases. And you literally did come with your own little suitcase.
One suitcase.
And what was in the suitcase?
And also they're moving from, it's in the middle of the book, and they're moving from right to left, while the numbers in the picture on the front, 1, 2, 3.
Three children.
Three children writing the numbers, 1, 2, 3, Arabic.
So your head you were exploding.
Yeah, from left to right. I think the interesting thing is that the fleeing start, what I mentioned is that it never ends, but there's another part of the story. It starts far before you actually embark on the dangerous journey. And one of the things that has always fascinated me, because one of the reasons is my parents couldn't actually remember what exactly happened, was it fascinated me to imagine what it means to distill all your life, as far as it's represented in objects, into one small suitcase. And I do that quite often. I look at, most of us have too much stuff. There's a brilliant sketch by George Carlin on stuff, how we are completely overstuffed with stuff, and he goes on with stuff, and after that you want to go home and throw out half of the stuff you have. But I thought, okay, if I had to leave tomorrow and the only thing I could take with me is a small suitcase, what would you put inside that suitcase? That fascinates me, not only as a practical kind of challenge, but as a poetic concept.
Yes, and now in California with climate refugees, I mean, people have to have their bag packed, their one bag that they would take. So this is a very ongoing concern. I like to also think of the fact that Jacob Lawrence, African-American artist, was going to MoMA looking at German expressionist paintings. There you are in MoMA, years later, looking at Jacob Lawrence's paintings. And then also that it's a German, Joseph Albers, who invites Lawrence to come teach at Black Mountain College, and he becomes the first Black American artist to teach at the college.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, so there's some kind of interesting connection there. So you have this your suitcase that you come with. I'm thinking also you came when you were 6, right? It's interesting because my father came from Ukraine at the same time with my grandmother, and he didn't remember very much. He would tell me, and he had forgotten Russian.
Was it traumatic, maybe?
Of course,
I mean, the memories before.
I think it. They came in a wagon where there was a civil war, so there were bodies around. I don't know how protected.
That was 1918? Or?
It was 21.
21. Okay.
So Ukraine wasn't quite
towards the end of the Civil War.
Or towards the end of the Civil War, but he told me he would sometimes dream in Russian, and maybe the trauma wasn't memorable for him because he'd been in the Pacific War, and I think that was so much more traumatic. It might have wiped out all the other trauma. But I think about that because he didn't talk about it very much, but his mother, my grandmother, told stories constantly.
Of course.
And I'm the next generation, and I couldn't get enough of them. I mean, I wanted to go back to the old country, which I have done. So in a way, it's the way the sense of exile or fleeing does carry on, because we carry it in us through those stories, right?
Absolutely. And I've noticed that people who have gone abroad, let's say in a comfortable manner, for example, they've received a scholarship, and then, so when I was living in India, there was actually quite a number of people, of course, who came to study in the US, and then they stayed here, and there you don't have that kind of obsession with the old stories. There's a different kind of dynamic at play. If you fled, I think one of the kind of motivating and defining aspects is that you close the door behind And at least at that particular moment, you cannot possibly imagine ever going back. Sometimes things change, like in our case, 1989. But until 1989, the understanding we had was that this is final. So it's this, and of course, if something is final, if you've completely closed the door, I think there is a natural instinct, a natural human instinct, to rediscover what you've lost through stories. So stories take on, I think, a different importance in that case.
Yeah, and depending on what the trauma was too, because on my Polish side, the people who came in 1906, everyone who didn't leave that was killed. So, but they could never tell me their names. So, there was, and also now we have ways of communicating back with where you fled from, whereas before it just seems so strange to me that, like, what, you can't tell me the name of my great-grandma. I mean, that things were so, like, you left and you left.
That was it.
And that was it. And now that you can go back, you're not the same person if you've been in exile, right? When you go back, you're changed.
Well, that's another thing that I dwell upon in the book, that people actually in German use that word Heimkehr, which literally means homecoming, but it's never a homecoming. So I actually came up with the word Fremdkehr, which means, I have no idea how you translate it, but kind of foreign coming, alienated coming. In German it works because in Germany we can create nouns all the time. It's allowed.
I know, I'm jealous. It's really cool.
But and the interesting thing is that after I wrote that, so many people at readings in Germany would then, especially that particular scene about going back to a place that's alien and no longer home, saying that they experienced the very same thing, but with a completely different biography. So someone, for example, who had left a small provincial town to go to Berlin, had spent all his life there, came back to look after his ailing mother. That person said, you see, I have the same experience. It seems that it should be home, but it's completely alien to me. And so many people with completely different biographies have had similar experiences. So I find that quite important, because there's a very wrong concept that once people have embarked on this journey, that there's a kind of simple going back. And I remember a few years back, I was doing research in Sierra Leone, and there was a group of people who had actually organized themselves into an NGO, who had all lived in Germany for quite a while, and who'd then be forcefully sent back.
Oh, wow.
And tragic stories. It started off on a humorous note. I asked, where are you from? And one of the ladies said in perfect German, Hannover. And she'd spent 12 years in Hannover, and she actually said that she identifies more now with Hannover as Hanover. But then what we realized is that there is none of them, so there were about 60 people, none of them could actually find a place in Sierra Leone, because they'd been gone for such a long time that they felt alienated by everything. And the only way they survived, and now the story becomes really gruesomely cynical, is that the German government actually pays the money so they would go to the schools in Sierra Leone and tell the young kids not to flee to Germany, because they're not going to make it and better stay at home, and look, I didn't make it. And I asked them, well, are you successful? And they looked at me and shook their head and said, no, of course not. No one believes us. I mean, they're thinking, you're just a loser. You're the loser who didn't make it. We're going to go and we're going to be successful.
Do you ever translate? Your English is obviously beautiful. So are you tempted to translate your own? Because
moving on.
No, so you work.
No, I don't like looking back. That's another theme in the book, is that I think there are two kinds of exiles: the nostalgic one and the one who never looks back. And also, if I look at historical examples, very typical example of the nostalgic type is Ovid. So Ovid, of course, is sent to exile somewhere near what is today the Romanian Black Sea coast. And he is lamenting all the time. Of course, the lament is very beautiful because he's a poet, but he's like, oh, I hate this and this is horrible. I want to go back. But of course, and in the US, that's well known. No need actually to even mention it. Of course, there's so many other people who, like, happily, hunters and gatherers, happily move into the world. And my father is a person like that. My mother is nostalgic. My father was always like, there's a whole world out there. Why should I care about small Bulgaria, which in any case is.
And you move around. You are really a citizen of the world. I mean, you are able to, I mean, it's part of your
I'm a deeply rooted nomad.
A deeply rooted nomad. You could say cosmopolitan used to have a negative term, right?
Well, it's interesting you would mention that, because I think at the moment it's one of these terms undergoing a kind of political reassessment. And now, at the end of September, we're going to do a big conference in Frankfurt, Cosmopolitanism from Below. So basically, how do we redefine it not as an elite concept of privilege, but as a concept of kind of universal understanding that is redefined by people from the global south and their kind of expectations towards something that could be universal cosmopolitanism.
So does that kind of tie into your thinking? And I'm going to be aware of time because we want to have time for questions as well, right? You've done a lot of thinking about utopias, why it's important to have utopian thinking. So when we're thinking about citizens of the world or this ability to move around, I mean, how does literature help us imagine a borderless world? How can it help us think about what that would look like? Is it possible?
I think, because I've been spending now several years writing a utopian novel, I think the difference is that if you allow imagination to run wild, you are starting a scene or a narration from the perspective of an outcome that you would like to see. While the way we are currently discussing socio-political issues is we are completely engulfed in the feasibility of the status quo. So usually when someone comes up with an idea that's, for example, open borders, that's maybe a little bit radical. I don't think so, but most people seem to find it quite radical. The very first reaction is to explain why it's not feasible. But those arguments are within the current framework. The utopian argument is to challenge you to think outside of the current framework. So basically we're trying to solve problems with the weaknesses of today's system, while the utopian approach is to say, let us go for something that I would call the yearning for improvement, and then let us work back from that. Let us think what would have to happen so that we have that outcome.
So is that artists in conjunction with social scientists, or is it artists leading the way to that kind of thinking, do you think?
Well, I think currently there is an understanding that if we want to have true transformation, and I think it's evident that we need it, that we also need to have kind of artistic visions. We need to have stories, we need to have, because stories are also engines of confidence.
Engines of confidence.
And what happens at the moment is that we're completely bogged down in a kind of apocalyptic fear of the future. So we have in the way I feel living in this world at the present is that we have this fat, lethargic present, and we have a kind of forgotten past, or a past engulfed in, let's say, narrations of power and privilege. And we don't see the future at all. The future is kind of blurry, or if we see it, it's apocalyptic, it's dystopian, it's, horrible things, no water, flooding, so forth, so forth. So how do we liberate our visions of future from these confines? And this is, I think, why we need utopian, not only in literature, I mean, utopian projects throughout the arts.
No, it's a really, really interesting subject, and I love how you find the language for that in the same way. Your metaphors for what it feels like to adopt a language. It's so physical. You talk about like bread sticking in the mouth. You talk about
a morsel, yeah.
A morsel, yeah. I thought that was, and then I think as you described that language in one of your talks, you talked about it being succulent, trying to find the language that really gives you the flavor of that absence. I wonder if we could, before we go into questions, if you would read that beautiful part that ends the text about the Amazon. I think it's a great utopian image in itself.
Can I just, before I read that passage, just read, because the book is dedicated to my parents, and there's a very short passage that I wrote with my parents in mind, and I would like to...
Good, because I also wanted to hear how you think of them as heroes.
Because it was my father's birthday yesterday, so I would like to read that section. 36, Arabic. 36 arabische Zahlen. Seine Mutter, sein Vater machen sich Sorgen über ihr fehlerhaftes Deutsch. Es mag hier und da grammatikalisch nicht korrekt sein, sagt er. Aber alles, was ihr sagt, ist verständlich. Welche von den Einheimischen, mit denen ihr regelmäßig verkehrt, beherrscht eine andere Sprache so gut wie ihr seine? Aber was ist mit unserem Akzent? Fragt die Mutter, der Vater. Der Akzent ist die Handschrift der Zunge. Stellt euch vor, wir redeten alle wie Nachrichtensprecher, wie Überbringer schlechter Botschaften. Der Akzent sorgt für die Schönheitsmale auf der Sprachhaut. 36. His mother and father fret over their errors in German. Here and there something isn't right grammatically. He says, but everything you say is comprehensible. Do any of the locals command another language as well as you do theirs? But what about our accent? Ask his mother, his father. Accent is the handwriting of the tongue. Imagine we were all to speak like newscasters, like bearers of bad news. The accent draws beauty marks on the skin of language.
Love that.
And now the passage that you requested.
Yeah, that is such a beautiful passage that you read.
20. In einer Großstadt mitten im Regenwald fließen der Rio Negro und der Rio Solimões zusammen. So behauptet die Landkarte. In Wirklichkeit weigern sich die Gewässer miteinander zu verschmelzen. Zwei unterschiedliche Flüsse prallen aufeinander. Eine scharf gezogene Grenze trennt beide. Der pH-Wert des Rio Negro beträgt 4,5, jener des Rio Solimões 7,6. Die Temperatur des Rio Negro misst 28 Grad Celsius, jene des Rio Solimões 22 Grad. Der Rio Negro führt jede Menge Schlamm und Lehm. Der Rio Negro fließt mit einer Durchschnittsgeschwindigkeit von 1,5 Stundenkilometer dahin. Der Rio Solimões ist mit 4 Stundenkilometer um ein Vielfaches schneller unterwegs. Es scheint, als könnte nichts die beiden vereinen. Doch keine 20 Kilometer später ist jeglicher sichtbare Hinweis auf die einstmalige Eigenständigkeit getilgt. Die Gewässer sind eins geworden. Ein neuer Fluss ist entstanden mit eigenem pH-Wert, mit spezifischer Temperatur und Geschwindigkeit, der sowohl Schlamm als auch Sand mit sich führt. Von nun an heißt der Fluss Amazonas. 20. Near a metropolis in a rainforest, the Rio Negro and the Rio Solimões flow together. Thus claims the map. The truth is that these waters refuse to coalesce, the two rivers instead repelling one another. A sharply drawn line divides them. The pH of the Rio Negro is 4.5, that of the Rio Solimões 7.6. The temperature of the Rio Negro measures 28 degrees Celsius, that of Rio Solimões 22. The Rio Negro brings with it a cargo of mud and silt. It flows at an average velocity of 4.5 kilometers an hour. At 4 kilometers an hour, the Rio Solimões is far more speedily underway. It would seem that nothing could join the two. Yet, 20 kilometers downstream, any visible sign of erstwhile sovereignty has been extinguished. The waters are one, a new river has emerged with its own pH value, temperature, and speed, carrying with it both mud and sand. Henceforth, it is called the Amazonas.
That is so beautiful, and we were just talking in the green room today. I thought if we were going to dedicate this talk to someone other than your dear father, there was in the New York Times today a story about a indigenous person in the Amazon who was the last of his tribe, and with him died a whole language. So with that beautiful metaphor of continuation, we also have the paradox of what we're losing. And I just thank you for finding this language to express these ineffable things that can actually give us a way to talk about it. So thank you deeply. And I'd be happy to hear your questions.
You seem to be traveling around the world and being all over the place. What did you find common among all humans? Because we are looking for like language difference, culture difference, and things like that. But I've been around the world like you did, so there's a commonality out there.
I think that it depends on what you want to find. I have a sense that people who want to see differences find them. People who want to see commonality find commonality as well. I would claim that there's far, far more things that bind us together, that we have in common on different levels than differences. I think differences are often quite superficial. If they're not superficial, they can often be translated into a similar concept, which just has a different form of expression. But the urge or the anthropological necessity for a particular cultural expression, let's say, I think is the same in most cultures. It's just that people have playfully come up with different ideas. There is, in terms of utopian concepts, I've found out that once again, the deepest yearning of humans apparently for a just, free, loving society seems to be quite similar. I found that quite intriguing. I wrote an essay on that, and because people usually claim, this is one of the criticisms against utopian thinking, they claim that one human's utopia is another human's dystopia. So basically they claim that there's such vast differences between our understanding of what a better world could be that we would never agree on the basics. And that doesn't seem to be the case. Looking at utopian concepts from different epochs and different cultures, there seems to be a kind of common understanding, and I find this very both endearing and encouraging, as to what kind of world we would really like to live in. A certain common understanding of equality, of respect, of the way we communicate, of a certain kind of dignity of every human being, and so on and so forth. I mean, I would have to go on for a long time. But that is something that I think we could also make good use of, that if our hopes are also quite similar, doesn't that mean that we can find common ground to kind of organize around these hopes in a truly universal sense, as a kind of global humanism
one would think.
one would think. So basically, I think the difference is, you know how we say beauty is in the eye of the beholder? I think difference is in the eye of the hater. I think people just want to see the difference. They want to they want to kind of insist on difference, and quite often I don't see it. Honestly, I think if you've lived, like for example, I lived for 5.5 years in Bombay, I actually forgot that I might be different because it didn't feel that way day to day. I felt at home. So yeah, so long winding answer to your question.
Ilija, you wrote, on occasion the refugee encounters people who are afraid of him. He would like to touch them, to take their arms or place his hand on their shoulders and whisper to them, but I am the one who is afraid. I fled from inescapable fear. I am the one who has lost everything. I am at the mercy of others. Not even your assets are in as much danger as my life. So could you talk a little bit, why are people so afraid of refugees? What is it that strikes fear into people on encountering refugees?
Well, I would like to start off by saying what I don't think the reason is, because I think very often the reasons given are not convincing. So the reason usually kind of brought forth in political discourse is the one of difference. Religious difference, of course, they come, for example, from Islamic countries, or they look differently. This has come up now in an ugly way this year because of the Ukrainian refugees. And then some people have asked the question, I think the very pertinent question, how come the other refugees were not welcome, but the Ukrainian?
Right.
And then people say, well, you know, they're like us. Which is often quite funny, because the last person who said that to me is an atheist, and he told me they have the same religion. And of course they're not like us, because 20 years ago we were discussing the enormous differences even amongst West and East Germans as a result of different political systems. So whether they're like us or not, I think is not the main reason. And the other thing that I learned was that the German refugees after the Second World War were treated just as badly. For those who don't know, there were several million Germans who fled different areas of what is today Eastern Europe.
Or forcibly relocated.
Or forcibly relocated. Many of them came to what then was West Germany. And there's a very, very good book written on that subject called Kalte Heimat, Cold Heimat. They were treated just as badly. Actually, there were more acts of aggression then. People had to be forced to take them in and so on and so forth. But those were people who had the same culture, same language, same background. And that was after 12 years of an ideology of we have a common kind of blood. And so I thought to myself, that cannot be the reason. So evidently it's more about that is why I wrote the sentence, even your assets are not are not as endangered as my life. I think it is a lot about assets. I think it's about people being afraid of losing something, people being afraid of being forced to give up something. Forceful sharing, I think to many people is something they detest. They usually claim that they would gladly, voluntarily give something, but not be forced into solidarity.
That's the fear that's spread, to make people fear refugees, as they will take something from you. Take something. I was also thinking just that image of someone arriving with a suitcase. I mean, it also reminds us of how, we have all this stuff, it's very destabilizing to see someone, they can survive on this one.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a provocation to our sense of entitlement. We feel in the wealthy countries that for some bizarre reason, we're entitled to this enormous wealth. And then someone comes who has lost everything. And that's a provocation to the kind of the superfluous aspects of our wealth.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine how people could fear, children at the border. Because I think of you were with your parents, only, here in our country, we had in the last administration, they didn't keep track, you know, their children who still can't find their parents. It's like, really? It's very hard to understand that people couldn't take a stand and make sure that that didn't happen. But
and the interesting thing is that something that saddened me a lot is that refugees from a previous generation were actually often quite hardcore against reaching out to the younger refugees, saying really stupid things like, well, it was tough for me, why should they be privileged now?
Yeah, which makes
no sense whatsoever.
Right.
Yeah. So it's a bit like, you know, when you enter a train, and at least in Germany, I don't know about Amtrak, but there's 5 people are sitting there, 6 seats. You open the door and you say, is that seat taken? Very rarely, maybe never, have the 5 people looked at me, smiled and say, oh, please, come in, have it. Half of them don't answer, and the other half of them, oh, okay, well. Oh. It's like they don't want someone else coming in. It's like, you know, and they've only been sitting there for half an hour, and they've already established kind of a new order of keeping other people out. Yeah.
They own it. Do we have one more question? Yeah, back there.
Well, thank you very much. I would like to come back to the text, and also I find interesting the inspiration you had by the paintings of Florence. The paintings of Florence are in their seriality, they are really connected to a particular time and history. And so I was asking, I had an impression that your text is structured by numbers, the right numbers and the wrong numbers, but I didn't really find any reference, any coordinates in time, in the sense of time and space. So we had these references to your biography and to those references are not in the text. So the only one is probably, I remember the Taylor from Alexandria, which is also kind of a very little mythological piece about the possibility. So why did you decide to write the text this way? It has no time, no space. Thank you.
That's a very good question. I was trying to formulate a kind of universal experience. You're absolutely right that I could have done that the way Lawrence did it, by being very concrete, very detailed, very steeped in a particular historical experience. But there's another way to do it, and that is to kind of slightly reach for the abstraction of literary forms like the parable, for certain forms of symbolism. So to kind of detach it from the particular. The language is always very concrete and particular, but there's very little information on the biographical or geographical context. So this was the way I wanted to also to detach myself from the autobiographical experience, because I didn't want it to be an autobiographical book. So I condensed everything I've heard throughout my life on these issues, and then I went and spoke to other people, to other refugees, and the particularities were very, very different. So I couldn't quite see how I could bring it all together. It would have been very much, I started off by saying there's this dish, Törlügevec, that would have been like 10 Törlügevec. It would have been like all over the place, too much. So I thought to myself, I would kind of make it into something that is decontextualized on the semiotic level and very, very concrete on the level of language. So that was kind of my
So in a way, it's kind of
concept.
disorienting to the reader to give us...
It's a little bit disorienting, yeah.
Purposely, so.
Yeah.
Can you speak a little bit about the longing? Yeah, I feel like that's a very human need that we all have. We want to belong somewhere or to something or someone. And as immigrants or refugees, I think, I don't know if there's ever a peacefulness that we arrive at where, okay, this is where I belong. Or I've heard everyone said that, we feel comfortable in many different places, but we don't feel the sense of belonging to any one place necessarily anymore. So I don't know how that is for you. Is it, I guess for some people maybe it's a religion or it's a spouse. So I'm curious how it is for you, and if now you live in Vienna, do you feel a sense of belonging there, and do you think you will stay there, or will you keep moving around?
Well, personally, I think that belonging is very, very intimate and individual. I always find it difficult when it's politically instrumentalized. So, for example, in Germany, one word that is part of this whole aspect of belonging is Heimat. And when people then make a political argument out of it, because I would say that belonging and Heimat starts with the most intimate aspects of our existence, so the people we love. I think I can even prove that because very, very many of the refugee families that I know and that I interviewed, one of the two wanted to flee and the other person was not particularly willing to flee. Yet they decided to flee together because the belonging of two people that love one another is much stronger, I think, than the belonging to a country or a city. So I think nationalism is the ideology for belonging. It claims that there are certain ways of belonging that are, I think, have very little to do with our intimate needs. And of course, belonging, the word says it, there's longing in it. And so in a way, I think belonging is also linked to something that we feel so strongly about that we keep on longing for it. And that can, to my understanding, that can only be something that's very close to us. That can be a certain landscape, a certain memory that is kind of reassessed to revisiting a place, or of course, for me personally, different pieces of music, of literature, games, for example. I feel I love playing backgammon, which is kind of part of my Oriental background. So I belong to that game very much. I feel actually comfortable playing that game. I feel at home. But of course, as you know, I can take the game with me and I can play it in many different places. So I think every person has this very, very, very individual, probably very kind of eclectic and idiosyncratic understanding of and feeling of and for belonging. I think it becomes very, very dangerous when people try to make that into an argument for the whole society, and then they claim that these are certain aspects of belonging. If you do not conform with that, then you're not part of us. Then I think it becomes seriously dangerous for a society.
Interesting. Yes, Caroline.
Thank you so much for your text. Amazing text. You are confusing me speaking about utopia.
Okay.
And I'm asking myself from where you take this hope facing the climate catastrophe and the situation we are in now. Speaking about utopia.
Well, that's a simple answer, because that is the hope, that we have to change. Since we have to change, I think when you look at human history, people quite often societies have managed to change. There are other examples, of course. I mean, the famous book Collapse, which tells the stories of how societies fell apart because they couldn't transform themselves. But very often we have been capable of radical transformation. And since we are forced now, I'm not hopeful that it would be always peaceful. I'm not hopeful that we would not become victims of some absolutely horrendous ecological consequences. But I'm very hopeful that we will understand that we have to completely transform our way of production, consummation, and living. Because very simply, there's no other way. And if there's no other way, I think people at some point will understand it. I would prefer it to be now, voluntarily, but evidently there is too much greed and too little intelligence, which I think kind of describes our times in one sentence. But I'm absolutely optimistic that, and one of the reasons actually I'm optimistic is that I noticed that interacting with other people that, just to end on an anecdotal note, this one essay that you asked about, the überflüssige Mensch, the superfluous human being. So I was giving a reading, and then a lady who was maybe 70, and she was very well dressed, and she actually looked absolutely like a bourgeois lady we would expect to look like. And at the end of my talk, she stood up and she said, very calmly, very elegant German, she said, well, of course capitalism has to go. I mean, there's no doubt about it. There's no future with capitalism. And she sat down and probably, had a strawberry tart afterwards and a glass of champagne. But I found that really amazing because there was none, like 60s, 70s, there was none of this kind of ideological kind of explosion of, she was calmly going about her business, realizing the evident. We have reached the threshold of human history where we are going to have to radically change. And now certain vetted interests, of course, don't acknowledge that, are fighting against that. But human history has a way of kicking out those who are guarding and who are guarding the status quo. So that is another reason I'm optimistic, because time and again you have unexpected explosions of change that, I mean, you asked me previously whether I'd heard that Gorbachev had died, and I hadn't heard, but the moment you asked me, I remember 89 in summer being together with other students and saying that, I'm optimistic that what is happening in Eastern Europe will not go on forever. And I think maybe 5 to 10 years. And everybody laughed at me and said, you're absolutely, you're crazy. This will go on for decades or centuries. That is what most people thought in 88, 89. And suddenly, dum, for many different reasons. And there you are. The wall came down and so on and so forth. So that is another reason I'm optimistic. One of the beauties of human history is that we cannot foretell the kind of, the earthquakes. Sorry, that's the wrong place to use this word. The discontinuities.
But isn't the hope also just simply born out of the instinct of survival?
Of course, but that would be an instinct that is probably, at least the way I see it, if it's linked to a certain form of intelligence, an instinct that would analyze different options and would then reach a certain intelligent conclusion, which options guarantee survival and which options probably make survival impossible. So if that instinct at the moment, I think, is, we were discussing it last night a little bit, is submerged under kind of willful blindness that does not want to accept, I think, things that everyone meanwhile understands if they were honest. So we have a kind of willful blindness that, and I'll give you an example that I found very, very interesting. There was a sociological study published last year, about why, I'm speaking of Germany now, why so many people are buying these huge SUVs. What is it? Service utility vehicle, is it?
SUV, yes.
Yeah. Interesting thing is, when I was here, I thought to myself, wow, there are so many big cars in the US. Now, coming from Germany this time, I thought, wow, there's so few big cars. Because we went from 0 to, I think, meanwhile, it's a third of the cars are these. So someone from some university made a study and tried to find out, why would people buy these huge cars, although they know that they're not fuel efficient, they are absolutely not ecological in terms of production, and there's absolutely no way we can survive if everybody drives an SUV. And the answer was really, really intriguing. The answer of most people was, I wanted to do it while it's still possible. And this while it's still possible includes two things. One is, we know that we're going to go over the cliff, but since we're going to go over the cliff, why not go over the speed limit while we're at it? But the second aspect is people realize, and I think the COVID experience was very, very helpful. People realize now, at least in Germany, I don't know enough about the US, they realize that at a certain point of crisis, the government or the people in charge will decide for them. They realize now what happened with the epidemic. At a certain point, all other rules, regulations, democratic traditions did not matter. Boom, this is what we're going to do. 1, 2, 3.
This is an emergency.
This is an emergency, therefore we have emergency powers. And I think many, many people realize that this is what's going to happen quite soon. We will be forced. It's actually starting now because planning the winter, we're not going to have enough gas, we're not going to have enough electricity. So already now emergency measures are put into place. The more the ecological crisis blows up, the more we will have such emergency measures. And therefore people realize this is our last hooray. Now we can have fun this one last year, which is also typical of this is Decameron, for example. The people, there's the plague, the people are in the castle, and they're saying, okay, let's drink up the wine, let's have one big feast before it's over. So in a way, this kind of, the sense that things will change is not always positive, because there's also this kind of end of the world orgy that accompanies it. If everything is going down the drain, I might as well buy myself an SUV and drive 200 kilometers an hour. So it's a complex situation, but anyway, allow me to remain optimistic.
Yeah, and thank you for confusing us. It's good. Thank you also.
Thank you.
Pleasure.